When I was building out my second desk setup, I wanted a single monitor that would be super versatile for both gaming and productivity work. Every time I come to this space, I bring along my custom 4080 PC rig and my MacBook Pro 16-inch. Finding a monitor that works well for both of these isn't easy, but I knew getting a gaming monitor would be the best option. This here is the Gigabyte M32U, which is a 4K 144Hz monitor with an IPS panel that provides shockingly accurate colors, high refresh rate gaming, and a great selection of ports to run any device of your choosing. You get all this for just under $700, which compared to other monitors with similar specs is actually a really good deal. Gigabyte managed to compromise very little here while making this the perfect future-proof option for PS5, Series X, and PC gamers. It's a 32-inch monitor which does take up a decent amount of room, but it's a great size to work on and be immersed in games. As someone who typically uses an ultrawide, every time I come back to this, it does feel a lot smaller. It's significantly taller, but I still feel like I lose a lot of screen real estate not having as much horizontal space. This screen is contained within a very minimal body that doesn't really look like a gaming monitor. It's very sleek, which is one of the reasons I wanted to get this model. It blends very nicely in the setup without being distracting while working. The bezels around the side are fairly slim, but there is a much bigger chin at the bottom with a Gigabyte logo at the center. The stand that comes with the monitor is pretty bulky, and since it is VESA mountable with a 100 by 100mm mount, I picked up a monitor arm from Vivo. This just clamps to the back of my wooden tabletop, and after screwing in the mount to the back of the monitor, sliding it into place is very easy. There's a clip attached to the arm that allows you to route the cables to keep everything looking tidy, but with the ports being at the bottom, it's still quite difficult to properly manage them. The cables tend to hang down still, which ruins the floating effect the arm has, and actually trying to get in there and plug one in is just such a pain in the ass. Luckily, the arm allows you to easily move and rotate the monitor to get at the ports more easily, but you still need to have an Allen wrench if you want to adjust the height or tilt, which is a bit of a pain. Down here, you have two HDMI ports, one display port, and a USB Type-C connection. For Mac users, this is pretty clutch, though note it only draws 10 watts of power, not anywhere near enough to power my M1 Pro. I'm instead using a USB-C to DisplayPort cable for the Mac connected to my Razer Thunderbolt 4 dock. It's pricey, but so worth it. The two HDMIs are 2.1 connectors, but the problem with them is they have a 24 gigabit per second bandwidth, just half of what true HDMI 2.1 is. For PC and Xbox Series X, this won't have any effect because they both support display stream compression, which allows their GPUs to still properly output the 4K resolution at 120 or 144 Hz, but the same cannot be said about the PS5. This feature DSC is completely absent, so it will result in a slightly reduced picture quality than what you would have from other displays, but honestly, this isn't something I've found to make a noticeable impact gaming on the PlayStation. You're still able to take advantage of the high refresh rates without experiencing any tearing, as this monitor does support VRR with AMD FreeSync Premium Pro. For NVIDIA cards, while it doesn't have the actual G-Sync chip, FreeSync is still compatible with G-Sync. Doing some research online, there has been quite a few people reporting flickering issues with VRR, especially on the PS5, but from all of my testing, I've not experienced these problems. There's also not been much noticeable motion blur, but Gigabyte does have an aim stabilizer feature that has black frame insertion to help eliminate any motion blur when playing FPS games. I really don't think it's necessary to have turned on, but it is there if you want it. VRR though is a great feature to have for the PS5 as it allows you to take advantage of 40 FPS modes within Spider-Man and Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart. This lets you have the highest visual fidelity and have the smoothest frame rate possible. The refresh rate isn't just nice to have for gaming, also desktop use. I've been used to using my 16-inch MacBook with 120Hz ProMotion, so it's nice to be able to go over to this monitor and still have that same smooth refresh rate. Moving around tabs and making small adjustments in DaVinci Resolve just feels more responsive and fluid. Whenever I'm on a 60Hz screen, the whole experience just feels sluggish. While there are higher refresh rate monitors out there, at 4K, you're basically never exceeding the 144Hz refresh rate, other than in a select few competitive games where you probably wouldn't even be looking at a 4K monitor anyways. Most of you also probably don't have a card like the 4080, but even with this, most new single-player games still struggle to hit even 100, and that's without taking advantage of ray tracing. For most people, I'd still honestly recommend going for a 1440p monitor because the performance trade-off for the slightly higher picture quality just isn't worth it in my opinion. I will admit that with desktop use, I do notice the increased clarity quite a bit compared to my ultrawide. Text is just much crisper and everything else looks much higher quality. The screen itself has a 140 ppi pixel density, which is a pretty significant improvement from the roughly 109 ppi on my 1440p ultrawide. If you're looking for a good monitor to use for light gaming gaming and work, I would recommend getting this one. The clarity is great for work, the refresh rate for smoother desktop use, and taking advantage of the few games that can match it is great. But if you're strictly gaming, I'd say 4K is a harder sell. Once in game, it's very difficult to notice that clarity difference when you're not comparing it side by side. Now, I will say slower paced story driven titles are where you'll mainly be able to notice the benefits. The 4080 inside my PC is a killer and does make this monitor a little more reasonable to use, but even that card struggles a lot in some single player games. The monitor is advertised as having a 1 millisecond response time, but in real world use, Arding's testing showed it being closer to 7 milliseconds at 144Hz or 9 milliseconds at 120Hz. What this means is that it's going to take each pixel about 7 to 9 milliseconds on average to transition to a new state of color and brightness. Compared to 1 millisecond, it seems like a lot, but this is still very low and means you won't be dealing with any noticeable motion blur, resulting in very smooth motion. The input lag is also very low. This is the time between when the GPU renders a frame and it's actually displayed on screen. It's just 4 milliseconds at 144Hz and 5 milliseconds at 120Hz. This means for FPS games, you're basically not going to notice any delay between your movements and when they're translated in game. Now, gaming monitors, at least in my opinion, tend to skimp out when it comes to color, but with this one, I've been pleasantly surprised. Straight out of the box, colors are quite accurate and vibrant. This is really nice, as I do use this monitor right now as an all-in-one for my setup. It hits a very wide color gamut, so games and media alike look very true to life. If you want to adjust the settings though, it's fairly simple. The button at the back lets you go through the OSD. I personally prefer having this to a bunch of different buttons, but it can still be a little finicky to use at times. This location is fine for my single monitor setup, but if I was using dual or even triple monitors, I'd much prefer having this at the bottom. So this menu system isn't the prettiest, but it's still fairly straightforward to navigate through. The only problem I have with it is just switching the input requires you to go through multiple different pages. The color profile of this monitor makes it really nice to work with in both DaVinci Resolve and Lightroom. I haven't done too much media consumption on here, but this monitor will work very well for it. Those colors really do pop, and the picture quality is top notch. Color matters less in games, at least in my opinion, but where I do really appreciate the accuracy is in those like Red Dead Redemption 2 that have beautiful landscapes. With this IPS panel, viewing angles are really good, so no matter how you're looking at the monitor, colors will be consistent. I've had issues in the past using cheaper monitors with a VA panel in that unless you're viewing it straight on, the picture looks really washed out. Now, there is a little bit of backlight bleed with this one. Luckily, it's not very noticeable when gaming, but if you have a black background or are just in a dark part of a game, you'll see it in the corners. The contrast isn't great, which is to be expected with an IPS panel, so blacks will often look more gray, especially if you're in a dark room. The local dimming feature when turned on is awful, not really making for much of an improvement. The monitor itself has a max brightness of 400 nits, which I've never had issues viewing in my room, but if you have this somewhere in direct sunlight, it may be harder to view. With the 400 nits of brightness, the monitor is technically HDR compatible, but in my use, this is nowhere near enough to properly use the feature. It honestly either doesn't make a difference or just washes out the picture, so I really think unless a monitor has like 600 nits plus, HDR is just not something you should even touch. The stock speakers also are not all that impressive, though aren't the worst built-in speakers I've ever heard. You're for sure going to want to get some external speakers though if you're going to be spending any significant amount of time listening to music or gaming through these. The monitor retails for just under $700, which is still a decent chunk of change, but for 4K 144Hz, it's actually a really good deal. This is one of the cheapest options with those specs and HDMI 2.1 without having any glaring compromises. I have this monitor in my second setup here, and it works really well for gaming and productivity. As a minimal monitor to use for my Mac and PC, I think it's honestly the best option at its price point. If you want to check it out, I'll have a link in the description, but otherwise, I appreciate you guys for watching. I'll see you all next week when we're going to be going over everything else in this setup, so make sure to stay tuned for that. But until then, take care.